are the hallmark of Jesus' messiahship. Today's story of the man born blind illustrates well beyond the actual miracle. In fact, as with all of Jesus' healings, it illustrates a greater truth about how helpless we are, really, without God's intervention. Some of you know my healing story, but for those of you who do not, here it is. As a child, I suffered from multiple ear infections. So much so that my eardrum was completely covered with scar tissue. I was told it looked like cauliflower. I was also told that I had lost about 20% of my hearing. Well, as a young adult, it got only worse and worse until I had lost 95% of my hearing in both ears. I used to sing alto for the seminary choir, and it was the worst possible range because that was the epicenter of the pitches that I had lost. And having relative pitch, it did not matter what my sheet music said. I was trying to match either the tenors or the sopranos, and it really just wasn't working very well. At home, I would turn up the TV until it was absolutely blaring. But to me, it just seemed normal. And finally, I went to an audiologist after a lot of prompting. The audiologist gave me a hearing test and told me that there was good news and there was bad news. The good news was the condition was reversible, and it was caused by the deterioration of 3 bones in the middle ear. It's called conductive hearing loss. A surgical revision was possible. The bad news was that since I had so much scar tissue on my eardrum, I was not to be a candidate for that surgery. And so I told my mother, who at the time had a group that was meeting in her home, that had ice cream sundaes and prayed for one another. And after some time, one of them said to my mother, "Robert needs a second opinion." So I made another trip to the lone audiologist in town, and she looked skeptical. But I asked her to take a second look. Is there any way possible? Well, she looked and said, "I've never seen anything like this. It looks just like someone took a laser and shaved the scar tissue off the surface of the eardrum." Well, when do you want to schedule the surgery? So my story is a little bit of identification with a man born blind. I think it incredibly sad that people believe that disabilities were caused by sinfulness, but the stain of sin in all of creation is a reality. That's why we get old. That's why we get sick. That's why we die. Disabilities and illness happen. They're a result of the fall. So I think in many ways, especially those of us who have entered the autumn of our life or have realized that we indeed are mortal and our bodies are slowly failing, we can identify with this man. We read that they asked him, whose sin caused this man to be born blind? Whose sin? Let's identify the person at blame. It was neither this man who sinned nor his parents, but it was in order that the works of God might be displayed in him. The disciples attributed this man's blindness, as was the typical outlook of the day, to sin. They just wanted to determine whose sin it was. And Jesus says, neither this man's parents nor him. Neither one. The man was born blind so that God may be glorified. So I place myself in the story. Now it seems just absurd that an infant who lost his hearing because of sin, but in truth, the longer we live, the more effects of sin around us prevail on our bodies. We feel that stain and that sting more and more. To quote Carolyn Stallworth, we get old and our bodies start breaking down. But we need to see that God has plans even in our weaknesses, that we may glorify God in him. This may sound odd, but it's true. And this may be an issue in your life as well. You may wrestle with a physical difficulty. You may wrestle with alcoholism or drug addiction or some other problem in your life, and you see it as a curse. But the truth is, if that issue puts you in an attitude of prayer before God, the malady becomes the source of healing. And in truth, we're all born spiritually blind. It's a condition that we call original sin. Observe, if you will, an infant, and they are concerned about one thing, and that is their needs, no one else's, their own needs. We, too, may have blindness to the needs of others. In this pandemic, the people born blind are all around us, hoarding toilet paper of all things. I still have yet to figure out what toilet paper has to do with the coronavirus, but obviously somebody thought it did. Now lastly, the cure. We all like that part. The man's blindness was cured when he believed Jesus, one, and his evidence washed his eyes. In a COVID-19 obsessed culture, it merits us hearing over and over, the cure must come from God. How were the blind man's eyes open? Was it anything that he did? No, he couldn't cure his blindness any more than you and I can cure our own maladies of body. Sure, he went into the pool and washed. That was evidence. That was obedience. But his act of washing didn't heal his eyes either. It was predicated by obedience. When we pray in this church, practicing our social distancing, and where we've had to fast from Eucharist for some time, we are underscoring that we have power in ourselves to help ourselves. The blind man, the thief on the cross, the woman caught in adultery, the Philippian jailer, the Gadarene demoniac, Lazarus, could they really help themselves? No. They needed a healer. Today we read this blind man's story, and I have told you my story, and you perhaps have your own story of healing. These stories are meant to be shared so that people can have faith and they can participate in this healing, in this loving, liberating, and life-giving part of what the church can offer through the power of Jesus Christ. When we read this blind man's story, we find hope. Hopefully, we find some sort of sense of how it is we are to deal with all of the disabilities that we see all around us and our own disabilities. This week, the man born blind shares his story as we share the story of how COVID-19 is affecting our own life. And when we emerge from this national, worldwide nightmare, we too will have new stories. How could we be the church in a time of plague, in a time of confusion, in a time where we don't know what tomorrow will bring? In his book, Tips for Growth, Charlie Klaus writes that it is, quote-unquote, Episcopalian shyness that is causing much of our decline. And while we have many on-ramp kind of activities that can help us be people who promote and share our stories, thereby making people interested in the church and interested in finding faith in Jesus, we often are quiet. Part of being the Jesus movement is sharing our blindness and how Jesus healed it. Sharing our disabilities and how Jesus healed it. Sharing everything that has been wrong with life that Jesus has overturned. That's how we spread the message. It's a church that shares its stories that is an unstoppable church. It's a church that shares its stories that is a healing church. It's a church that shares its stories that becomes a holy church.